All right, welcome back. The title of this mini lecture is Navies or the U.S. Navy prior to 1914. And before we get into all of this, I want to tell you kind of one, maybe two stories. So, I grew up around the Chicago area, and I grew up in the 80s. And when I was little, you could go to Navy Pier, and it was an actual naval pier at that point. It wasn't just a big Ferris wheel and that kind of stuff. None of that was there. And every now and again, big U.S. Navy ships would come in. And they were big to me because I was 4. And you would wait for hours and hours. At least I thought, because I was 4. And you would get a chance to go on them and you would get to tour them. And it was amazing. These ships seemed larger than life. They were fascinating. And that was really the only connection to the Navy or ships that I had. I lived in a suburb with no real water sort of connected to me. Occasionally we would go to Lake Michigan, and that was about it. So the understanding that there was a world on the oceans, that individuals traversed the seas, was largely something that existed only in books and stories and pictures. To that end, I think that for many of us, if we do not have a direct connection to seafaring communities, we are apt to be forgetful about the importance that navies and ships play to our everyday lives, be it today in the 21st century or in previous generations. We are forgetful of how much of our basic economy operates through seafaring traffic around the world, how important navies are to issues of national security, both for the Americans and for other nations, of course, as well. So, let's kind of talk about then 5 themes for us to think about. First would be the age of sail. We can't tell the story of the entirety of naval histories in a few moments, but the first half of the 19th century is an important period for our purposes. It's a period in which, when we're talking about naval development, you're moving into early steam engines, but largely you're looking at larger sailing ships connected back to the 18th century and their ability to project force by the number of cannons that they're putting on their decks. So, of course, thinking of the power of the British Navy in the first half of the 19th century and the ability of their economy to spend money to produce these kinds of ships. Secondly, of course, is going to be ironclads. The U.S. Navy is going to transform during the era of the Civil War because you have naval secretaries both for the United States as well as for the Confederacy that invest in new technologies that will be deployed in, first case, the Battle of Hampton Roads in 1862, and in ship development after that. So ironclads, of course, meaning this idea of the producing with, ships that are literally ironclad. So you have the Monitor and the Merrimack, right, and the conflict that they engage in. This really transforms naval thinking, both for the Americans as well as for the wider world. And so in the second half of the 19th century, you start to see, of course, a haves and have-nots when it comes to naval affairs, those who can afford to purchase these kinds of ships and to produce these kinds of ships, and those who cannot. The third point for us, of course, would be Mahan. Now, this stands for Alfred Thayer Mahan, who was a professor, taught at the naval professor, War College professor. And Mahan wrote a fairly famous book in the late 19th century, and it was called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. And for Mahan, what he basically argued was over the last centuries prior, nations that had powerful navies, that had the ability to project force via their navies, tended to be able to be successful. Now, policy people and thinkers in the second half of the 19th century were inspired by Mahan's work and would ultimately kind of craft new foreign policy in an age of imperialism and colonialism around it. Meaning, if they want to be able to take colonies, and power is defined by that, then you've got to have the tools to be able to achieve it. and that the Navy is a tool that can help you to be able to achieve this power status. This is partly what leads the Americans into the early 20th century in something called the Great White Fleet, of these larger battleships, these new era of battleships that were taking around the world, as a projection of Roosevelt and his sort of corollary with his Monroe Doctrine. And again, these new battleships are unlike things that the rest of the world had seen before. Perhaps the best example of this would be the HMS Dreadnought, that the British build, but many others sort of serve this purpose. And again, there's an assumption that battleships are where sort of naval focus should be. But the idea, of course, was that the Dreadnought kind of, along with a few other ships at the same time, begins a new class of battleship, an arms race that would contribute eventually to World War I. All right. Thank you so much.